Welcome to Mr. Vault Stories. Tonight we uncover the secrets of Hawthorne Manor, where a locked room murder hides betrayal, deception, and deadly consequences. Grab a cup of coffee and get ready for a classic Hercule Poirot mystery. Let's begin.
Chapter 1. A Quiet Arrival. The train pulled into Little Keyham Station with a slow, deliberate hiss, as though reluctant to part with its passengers. The landscape beyond the platform was a picture of English pastoral charm. Rolling green fields, neatly hedged lanes, and a cluster of stone cottages that seemed untouched by time. Yet, as the great Hercule Poirot often reminded me, even the most tranquil places could conceal the darkest of secrets. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, was quite looking forward to this trip. The war years and my subsequent travels had kept me away from the English countryside for far too long, and a weekend of good company and peaceful surroundings seemed a welcome change. Beside me, Poirot surveyed the scenery with a critical eye. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured, straightening the cuffs of his immaculate gray suit. "Such a place appears calm, orderly, an oasis of simplicity." I smiled. "For once, Poirot, let's not expect intrigue. We've come for a weekend of relaxation, not a case." Poirot's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Mon ami, murder is like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. One does not always expect it, yet it arrives all the same." I laughed at his dramatics, though I should have known better than to dismiss such words. Waiting for us at the end of the platform was Dr. Theodore Finch, an old acquaintance of mine from my army days. He was a stout, ruddy-faced man, his manner both brisk and affable. "Hastings, old fellow," he greeted me with a firm handshake before turning to Poirot. "And you must be the famous Monsieur Poirot. What a pleasure." Poirot gave a modest incline of the head. "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Finch. You are well?" "As well as a country doctor can be," Finch said with a wry smile. "Which is to say, not particularly busy. Nothing but colds and twisted ankles to deal with here." Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "And yet it is often in the most uneventful places that one finds the greatest mysteries." Finch chuckled, though I detected a flicker of something else. Hesitation, perhaps. We climbed into his motor car, and as we drove through the winding country lanes, Finch regaled us with tales of the village and its peculiar inhabitants. It was not long before he slowed the car and gestured toward a grand estate nestled beyond an avenue of towering oaks. "That's Hawthorne Manor," Finch announced. "Home of Sir Reginald Willoughby, though not for much longer, I imagine." I turned to him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Finch shrugged. "He's not a well man. I don't mean in body. Physically, he's robust enough. But he's been acting strange. Talks of being watched. Says someone's out to get him." He chuckled awkwardly as if trying to downplay it. "You know how these old men get. Start worrying over shadows." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And does he have reason to worry?" Finch hesitated, then changed the subject. "His wife, Lady Margaret, is the one who invited you, Poirot. Apparently she's something of a fan. Read about you in the papers." Poirot preened slightly. "Ah, it is always gratifying to be appreciated." Finch pulled up outside the Rose and Crown Inn, where we would be staying. Arrangements had been made for us to visit Hawthorne Manor for afternoon tea. At the appointed hour, a sleek black motor car arrived to collect us. The chauffeur, a stern-looking man, spoke little as we wound through the countryside toward the estate. Hawthorne Manor loomed before us, a majestic yet somber house of gray stone, its ivy-clad walls exuding a sense of both grandeur and secrecy. The butler, Jennings, received us with the air of a man who had seen one too many intrigues unfold under his roof. Lady Margaret Willoughby greeted us in the drawing-room, her presence regal yet tinged with fatigue. She was a striking woman in her 50s, her silver-streaked hair pinned into a meticulously arranged chignon. "Monsieur Poirot," she said warmly, her voice carefully controlled, "it is such a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure, madam, is mine." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, his sharp eyes taking in the tightness around her lips, the slight tremor in her hands. The other guests were already gathered. Charles Willoughby, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir, had a brooding, restless energy about him. "I suppose you're here to entertain us, Poirot," he said dryly. Eleanor Marsh, a poised, intelligent woman, regarded us with measured curiosity. Henry Fielding, the family solicitor, observed everything with hawk-like intensity. Reverend Tobias Graves, the local vicar, sipped his tea in pensive silence. Violet Simpson, the devoted housekeeper, moved about with a watchful presence. And finally, Sir Reginald Willoughby himself entered. A towering presence of a man, he might have once been handsome, but time had left its mark. His deep-set eyes held suspicion. His lips curled with barely veiled irritation. "So you're the detective," he said, scrutinizing Poirot. Poirot gave a slight bow. "I am he." Sir Reginald exhaled heavily. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Monsieur Poirot. A man who asks too many questions rarely likes the answers he finds." A charged silence followed. After tea, as dust settled, Poirot and I took our leave, but an uneasy feeling followed us. Poirot, uncharacteristically quiet, walked slowly to our car, deep in thought. That night, just past midnight, a terrible scream shattered the silence. I bolted upright in bed. Poirot was already awake, slipping into his dressing gown with alarming calm. "A scream in the night, Hastings," he murmured. "And in such a peaceful village, that is always a bad sign." A frantic knock on our door confirmed our worst fears. It was Dr. Finch, his face pale as death. "There's been an accident at Hawthorne Manor. Sir Reginald is dead." Poirot let out a small sigh, as if he had expected this all along. "Come, Hastings, let us see what the night has brought us." As we stepped into the cold, misty night, I could not shake the feeling that we had walked straight into something far darker than an ordinary country retreat. Chapter 2. The Locked Room Enigma. The mist was thick over Hawthorne Manor as we arrived in the dead of night. A single light burned in one of the upper windows, casting a faint glow over the darkened grounds. The air was heavy with moisture and something else, unease. Poirot stepped lightly from the motor car, his face unreadable. Dr. Finch led us inside, his expression drawn and anxious. "He's in his study," Finch said. "Dead? Locked in from the inside?" A flicker of interest passed over Poirot's face, but he said nothing. The house was awake but silent. The household stood in hushed disbelief, gathered in the hall like ghosts, unwilling to speak aloud. Lady Margaret sat with a stiff back, her face pale but composed. Charles Willoughby stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed tightly. Eleanor Marsh, usually so poised, had a look of quiet shock. Jennings, the butler, opened the study door with a shaking hand. "Sir Reginald did not answer his calls," he murmured. "We had to break it down." Poirot entered first, and I followed, my breath catching at the sight before us. Sir Reginald Willoughby sat slumped in his high-backed chair, his body twisted slightly to one side. His head rested against his shoulder, and one arm hung limply over the armrest. A glass of port sat untouched on the desk. Nearby, a chessboard remained mid-game, an unfinished move left behind. Poirot moved closer, his keen eyes missing nothing. "No struggle," he murmured. "No sign of violence. And yet he is dead." Dr. Finch nodded. "I examined him the moment we broke the door down. No visible wounds. I smelled bitter almonds. Cyanide poisoning." "Cyanide, eh?" Sergeant Wilkes, the local constable, had arrived and was taking notes. "But how?" If it was in his port, why didn't he drink it? Poirot lifted the glass delicately with his handkerchief, peering inside. He sniffed, then set it down again. "Curious, is it not?" he said lightly. Wilkes frowned. "And then there's the locked room, sir. We had to break it down. That means no one could have entered or left after the crime." "A puzzle indeed," Poirot murmured. "But puzzles, Sergeant, are merely a matter of observation and logic." He moved about the room with slow, deliberate precision, taking in every detail. His gaze lingered on the fireplace, where the last embers smoldered weakly. Something white and charred lay among the ashes. With a gloved hand, Poirot retrieved a half-burned scrap of paper. He held it up to the light, and though much of it had turned to ash, faint words were still visible. "For what you did." Poirot's expression darkened. "A threat, Hastings," he murmured. "A message meant for Sir Reginald, now lost to the fire." "Do you think he burned it himself?" I asked. Poirot tapped his chin. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone else did, to destroy evidence." He continued his examination, his hands hovering over the chessboard. His fingers brushed over the bishop, then paused. He lifted it carefully. "Ah," he murmured. "This piece, it is out of place." I frowned. "It's just a game, Poirot." Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet in chess, every move is deliberate. Why was this piece moved before he died?" Before I could answer, a startled cry rang from the hallway. Poirot whirled around as Violet Simpson, the housekeeper, stumbled into the room. "Pardon me, sir," she gasped, her face pale. "But I just remembered something." Poirot gestured for her to continue. "I was walking past the study last night, just before midnight," she said breathlessly. "I heard voices inside. Sir Reginald was speaking to someone." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "To whom?" Violet shook her head. "I don't know, but they were arguing. Sir Reginald sounded angry." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And the other voice?" I think it was a man, but I couldn't hear clearly." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, Madame Simpson. That is most helpful." As she left, I turned to him. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" He was silent for a long moment, then gestured toward the room. "Consider, Hastings, a man who fears for his life, who burns a letter before he dies, a chessboard with a move left unfinished, a drink that should be poisoned yet remains untouched, and now the revelation that he was not alone before his death." I shivered. "You mean someone was here before the door was locked?" "Precisely," Poirot murmured. "And that, my friend, is the key to our mystery." He turned back to the desk, his fingers skimming lightly over the surface. He paused suddenly and then leaned in, studying something so small I almost missed it. A faint smudge on the wood. Poirot ran a gloved hand over it, then straightened with a satisfied nod. "Hastings, my friend," he said quietly. "I know how he was poisoned." I gaped at him. "Already?" Poirot merely smiled. "But of course. The little gray cells, they do not fail me." Before I could question him further, Charles Willoughby entered the room, his face stormy. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "My uncle was an old man. If he took ill and collapsed, so be it. But all this talk of murder, why? What motive could there be?" Poirot studied him carefully. "That, monsieur, is what we shall soon discover." Charles exhaled sharply and stalked away. Poirot turned to Sergeant Wilkes. "We will need a full analysis of the body." Wilkes nodded. "I'll send for the coroner at first light." Poirot tapped his fingers against his lips. "That is good. But mark my words, mes amis, this was no accident. This was a most deliberate murder." He turned to me, eyes gleaming with thought. "Hastings," he murmured, "someone in this house is a killer, and if we do not move quickly, they will strike again." Chapter 3. The web of lies. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the village of Little Keyham as though reluctant to reveal what had transpired the night before. The great house of Hawthorne Manor stood dark and silent, its grand walls concealing secrets, betrayals, and murder. I rose early, but Poirot had already been awake for some time, sitting near the window of our room at the Rose and Crown Inn, sipping his morning tisane. His sharp eyes followed the movements outside, though he said nothing for a long time. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Well, Poirot, you said last night you knew how Sir Reginald was poisoned. Will you finally share your thoughts?" He glanced at me, the corners of his lips twitching. "Ah, Hastings, you're always impatient to arrive at the solution. But, mon ami, we must first establish why before we determine who." I sighed. "And how do you propose we do that?" Poirot set down his cup and rose to his feet. "By speaking to those who lie," he said simply. I frowned. "But we don't know who's lying." Poirot's smile deepened. "Oh, but we do. When we arrived at Hawthorne Manor, the tension in the house was palpable. The guests and household staff were subdued, yet each carried a guarded expression as if they were measuring their words, afraid to reveal too much. Poirot wasted no time in beginning his interviews, gathering them one by one in the small morning room, where the sunlight barely filtered through the heavy drapes. First came Lady Margaret Willoughby. She was as composed as ever, her fingers lightly touching the pearls at her throat, though her eyes were red-rimmed from a lack of sleep. "Madam," Poirot said, his voice gentle, "your husband had been troubled in the days before his death. Can you tell me why?" She hesitated. He had been receiving letters." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Ah, and you did not mention this before?" She stiffened. "I did not think them important. They were unsigned, threatening. Reginald dismissed them at first, but then he began to worry." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Do you know where these letters are now?" She shook her head. "I searched for them this morning. They're gone." Poirot exchanged a glance with me, another piece of evidence conveniently missing. "Did Sir Reginald mention whom he suspected?" Poirot pressed. Lady Margaret hesitated, then exhaled. "He mentioned two names, Charles and Eleanor." "Eleanor Marsh?" I turned to Poirot, expecting him to show surprise, but he merely inclined his head. "Merci, madame. That will be all for now." Next came Charles Willoughby, Sir Reginald's nephew. He strode into the room with an air of irritation, as though the entire affair was nothing more than a nuisance. Poirot studied him carefully. "You did not seem particularly grieved by your uncle's death, monsieur." Charles scoffed. "He was not a man to be mourned. We hadn't spoken properly in years. He never approved of me." "Because of money troubles, perhaps?" Poirot suggested lightly. Charles's eyes flickered. Well, I suppose he never liked the way I handled my affairs." Poirot's tone remained casual. "And yet he had made you his heir, had he not?" Charles tensed. "Yes." "But he was planning to change his will," Poirot added smoothly. "Did you know that, monsieur?" For a brief moment I saw it, a flash of something in Charles's eyes. Panic? Then he recovered. "That's ridiculous." Poirot merely smiled. "Ridiculous? Perhaps." When Eleanor Marsh entered, she seemed pale but composed. Poirot's manner was markedly different with her, gentler, yet intensely watchful. "Mademoiselle, forgive me for asking, but did you know that Sir Reginald was planning to change his will?" She looked startled. "No. Why would he?" Poirot folded his hands. "To atone for a past betrayal." Eleanor's face remained still, but I saw a flicker of something deep within her eyes, anger, pain. "Did he tell you this?" Poirot pressed. She swallowed. "He said that he had wronged someone, that he had been blind to the consequences of his actions, but he never said who." Poirot leaned forward. "And you, mademoiselle, Did you hold resentment toward Sir Reginald? Eleanor's jaw tightened. I hated him for what he did to my father. Poirot nodded. But did you hate him enough to kill him? She inhaled sharply. No. For a long moment, Poirot studied her. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured for her to go. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Poirot, do you think she... Poirot raised a hand. Let us not jump to conclusions, Hastings. We have one more to speak to. The final interview was with Henry Fielding, Sir Reginald's solicitor. A shrewd man, he regarded Poirot with measured wariness. Poirot wasted no time. Monsieur Fielding, you were aware of Sir Reginald's new will. Fielding hesitated. I was. And yet it was not finalized. Fielding shifted. No, he had not signed it yet. Poirot nodded slowly. Tell me, monsieur, did you and Sir Reginald argue about it? Fielding stiffened. No. Poirot's gaze bored into him. Are you quite sure? A long silence. Then finally Fielding exhaled. All right. Yes, we argued. He accused me of mishandling his affairs in the past. Poirot's mustache twitched. How interesting. Fielding frowned. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. Poirot gave a mild smile. Ah, but monsieur, everyone says that. As we left the morning room, my head spun. Poirot, that was a tangled web, if ever I saw one. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Indeed, Hastings. The letters, the will, the missing documents, and the argument, each is a thread leading us to the truth. I exhaled. And do you know where they lead? Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Not yet. But soon, Hastings. Very soon. As we stepped into the dim corridor, a gust of wind rattled the windows, making the manor seem even more foreboding. And for the first time, I wondered, who was the next target? For a murderer, once having struck, does not stop until their game is complete. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The morning at Hawthorne Manor had been consumed by Poirot's meticulous interviews. Yet as we stepped into the gray light of the day, it was clear that our work was far from finished. Sir Reginald's past had begun to stir beneath the surface, whispering secrets long buried. The only question now was who had unearthed them, and who had killed to keep them hidden. We had barely left the manor's grounds when Poirot turned to me, his sharp green eyes brimming with thought. Hastings, my friend, he murmured. What do you make of our suspects? I rubbed my chin. Well, Charles Willoughby clearly has something to hide. He was tense, evasive. And the fact that Sir Reginald was going to change his will. He must have been furious. Poirot nodded. Très bien. And Mademoiselle Eleanor? I hesitated. She had a real grudge against Sir Reginald. She admitted it herself, but I don't believe she killed him. She seems more hurt than vengeful. Poirot's lips twitched. Ah, the instincts of the sentimental Englishman. And what of Monsieur Fielding? I exhaled. Now there's a man who isn't telling the truth. He had every reason to fear Sir Reginald exposing his financial misdeeds. But Poirot, I still don't understand how the murder was actually committed. Poirot gave me a knowing look. Patience, Hastings. The how will come when we understand the why. With that, he turned briskly down the lane. Come, mon ami. There is someone else we must speak to, Reverend Graves. The vicarage was a modest stone house nestled at the edge of the village near the old churchyard. It had an air of stoic simplicity, with well-kept gardens and books stacked neatly by the front window. The door was opened by Reverend Tobias Graves himself, his tall frame stooped slightly, his thin fingers clasped together as if in silent prayer. His expression was one of quiet restraint, yet there was something else beneath it, unease. Poirot greeted him warmly, yet his eyes never left the vicar's face. Monsieur le Vicaire, I thank you for seeing us. A most troubling affair, this murder. Reverend Graves sighed deeply. Indeed. It is a terrible thing, gentlemen. I have known Sir Reginald for many years. His manner was difficult, but his influence in the village was undeniable. Poirot took a seat opposite the vicar, his small hands folded neatly. Tell me, Reverend, did Sir Reginald ever confide in you? The vicar's fingers twitched slightly. I don't know what you mean. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Come, Monsieur Graves, you were his spiritual counsel. Did he confess to a sin weighing upon his conscience? There was a long pause. Then the vicar sighed deeply. Yes, there was something from his past. Poirot leaned forward. And what was that, mon père? Reverend Graves hesitated. It was about Alfred Pembroke. I stiffened. That name again. The man Sir Reginald had betrayed. The father of Eleanor Marsh. The vicar continued, his voice low and troubled. Sir Reginald came to me 3 nights ago. He spoke of his wrongdoing toward an old friend, and how he had spent years justifying it to himself, but suddenly he could no longer find peace. He believed that someone was seeking retribution. Poirot exchanged a glance with me. What exactly did he fear? Poirot pressed. Reverend Graves hesitated. He said he had received a letter, that someone knew the truth about Pembroke, and that he would soon pay the price for his sins. Poirot's expression did not change, but I could feel the shift in his intensity. And did he tell you what he planned to do? The vicar nodded. Yes. He planned to change his will, to finally set things right. I inhaled sharply. Poirot rose smoothly. Merci, Monsieur Graves. You have been most helpful. The vicar hesitated. Monsieur Poirot, do you think Sir Reginald was right? That someone was out for revenge? Poirot paused at the doorway. It is not what I think, mon père, but what the facts tell us. And with that we left. Back at the Rose and Crown Inn, Poirot sat deep in thought, his fingers lightly tapping against the arm of his chair. I, meanwhile, felt my own frustration mounting. Poirot, I still don't see it. Yes, Sir Reginald felt guilty. Yes, someone was threatening him. But that still doesn't explain how he was poisoned, or why the door was locked from the inside. Poirot gave me a look of exaggerated patience. Hastings, mon ami, let me ask you a question. What is more important, a glass of poisoned wine, or the one thing in the room Sir Reginald touched before he died? I frowned. The chessboard? Precisely. Poirot's gaze sharpened. The bishop was moved. Why? Because Sir Reginald left us a message. I stared at him. But what does it mean? Poirot sighed. Think, Hastings. Sir Reginald had no time for a grand gesture. His only chance was to use what was in front of him. The bishop. It was his clue. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Was Poirot saying the bishop represented the murderer? Before I could ask, a sudden commotion in the hall made us both turn. The door to the inn burst open, and in stumbled a pale, gasping figure. Eleanor Marsh. Poirot was at her side in an instant. Mademoiselle, what has happened? She clutched the doorframe, her breath ragged. Someone tried to kill me. I inhaled sharply. Poirot guided her to a chair, his voice soothing. Tell me everything. Eleanor swallowed. I went back to my room after speaking to you, and there was a cup of tea waiting on my nightstand. I thought nothing of it, but after a few sips, I felt dizzy. My vision blurred. Poirot's expression darkened. And then? She shook her head. I collapsed. When I woke, I was in my bed, but the tea was gone. Someone took it. Poirot's jaw tightened slightly. So, our murderer has made another move. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. First Sir Reginald, now Eleanor. Someone was trying to cover their tracks, and they weren't finished yet. Poirot rose to his feet, his eyes gleaming with deadly certainty. "Hastings," he said softly, "the net is tightening, and soon the murderer will make their final mistake." I swallowed hard, for I feared what that final mistake might cost. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Twist. The dimly lit parlor of the Rose and Crown Inn was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Eleanor Marsh, still pale from her near brush with death, sat slumped in an armchair, her fingers clutching a glass of water. Poirot stood beside her, his expression one of quiet intensity. I could tell his little gray cells were at work, processing everything, assembling the puzzle piece by piece. "Someone tried to poison you, mademoiselle," he said softly. "And yet it was not a sudden act of impulse. It was planned." Eleanor swallowed, her voice unsteady. "But, why?" "I haven't done anything. I don't know anything." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, mademoiselle. You know something. Perhaps you do not realize its significance, but the murderer does." I shuddered. "Poirot, do you think this is because of what she told us about Sir Reginald's confession?" Poirot nodded. "Possibly, or perhaps it is something more subtle, more dangerous. Perhaps she saw something, overheard something, and our murderer, knowing this, attempted to silence her before she remembered." Eleanor's fingers trembled. "Then, you think they will try again?" Poirot's expression darkened. "If they believe the danger is still present, then yes." A cold chill passed through me. Sir Reginald had been the first victim, but now we were no longer dealing with just a calculated, premeditated crime. We had a murderer who was desperate, willing to strike again to cover their tracks. And a desperate killer was always the most dangerous. I turned to Eleanor. "Do you remember anything unusual from last night? Anyone behaving strangely? A visitor, perhaps?" She shook her head. "No. At least not that I can recall." Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. "No? But let us think logically. Someone prepared that poisoned tea in advance. Either they placed it in your room before you arrived, a risky move, or they delivered it afterward, pretending it was meant for you." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Jennings, the butler, he often brings tea to the guests before bed." Poirot held up a hand. But do not be too hasty, mademoiselle. Jennings is a servant. He follows orders. The real question is, who told him to do so?" We sat in silence for a moment, and then Poirot straightened abruptly. "Come, Hastings, there is work to be done." Back at Hawthorne Manor, the house had settled into a strained quiet. The guests and servants moved cautiously, as though aware that danger lurked among them. Jennings, the butler, greeted us at the door, his usual stoicism replaced by visible unease. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I trust Miss Marsh is recovering." Poirot nodded. "She is, but I must ask you a question, monsieur. Who placed the tea in her room last night?" Jennings blinked. "Why, sir, I did, as I always do, for the guests who requested." "And who requested it?" Poirot asked sharply. Jennings frowned. "It was left in my evening instructions, sir. I assumed Miss Marsh had asked for it herself." Poirot's expression did not change, but I felt the air shift. "Ah, and who writes the evening instructions?" Jennings hesitated, and then he uttered a name that sent a jolt through me. "Lady Margaret." Poirot wasted no time in summoning Lady Margaret to the drawing-room. She arrived composed as ever, though there was a flicker of irritation in her sharp blue eyes. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope you do not mean to interrogate me," she said coolly. "We have all been through enough distress." "Ah, but, madam, distress or no, there is still a murderer among us," Poirot said smoothly. "And we must speak of your instructions to Jennings last night." Lady Margaret tilted her head slightly, but her fingers, those perfectly manicured hands, tightened around the armrest of her chair. "My instructions?" Poirot nodded. Oui, madame. Jennings informs us that the order to bring tea to Mademoiselle Marsh's room came from you. She inhaled sharply, but recovered almost at once. Perhaps I did leave a note. I don't recall. But why does that matter? Poirot's voice remained calm, yet there was steel beneath it. It matters, madam, because that tea was poison. The room fell silent. Lady Margaret's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came out. Then, with great effort, she said, "That is impossible." Poirot shook his head. "Impossible? No, madame. It is a fact." I leaned forward, watching her closely. "You did not poison the tea yourself, did you?" She turned to me with a flash of anger. "Of course not. Why would I?" Poirot's gaze never left her face. "Then tell me, madam, who asked you to write that note?" Lady Margaret hesitated. It was my husband." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Sir Reginald?" She nodded, but now her composure was beginning to crack. "Yes, he told me to ensure that Miss Marsh was given tea before bed. He wanted her to feel comfortable." Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw something in his eyes, a spark of revelation. "Madame," he said gently, "Sir Reginald is dead. But someone used his name, did they not? Someone who knew you would obey without question." Her face paled. I don't know." Poirot sighed. "Madame, let us speak plainly. Either you are lying, or you are protecting someone. Which is it?" Lady Margaret's jaw tightened. "I am protecting no one." Poirot regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well." I was surprised that he did not press further, but Poirot's mind worked in ways I could never anticipate. As we left the drawing room, I turned to him. "Poirot, are you suggesting that Lady Margaret's note was forged?" He tapped his temple. "Ah, mon ami, do you not see? Lady Margaret wrote the note, but she did not understand its purpose. Someone convinced her to leave that instruction, and that someone is our murderer." A slow, chilling realization crept over me. The murderer had been one step ahead of us the whole time. And if they had failed to kill Eleanor, who would they target next? Poirot must have sensed my thoughts, because he turned to me, his voice quiet, but filled with certainty. "Hastings," he murmured, "the killer knows we are close, and soon they will make their final move." A storm was coming, and in its wake, only one truth would remain. Chapter 6. The Final Clue. A hush had fallen over Hawthorne Manor as dusk settled over the village of Little Keyham. The household was on edge, shaken by Eleanor's near murder and the growing realization that a killer walked among them. It was no longer just about Sir Reginald's death. Someone had tried to silence Eleanor, and that meant they were growing desperate. Poirot, however, remained unshaken. If anything, he seemed more focused than ever, his sharp eyes missing nothing as we moved through the dimly lit corridors of the manor. "Hastings," he murmured as we entered Sir Reginald's study, "the time has come to uncover the final clue." I frowned. "I thought you already knew who did it." Poirot's lips twitched. "Mon ami, I always know more than I say. But knowledge is nothing without proof, and the proof, we shall find it here." The study remained exactly as we had left it. The heavy oak desk still bore the untouched glass of port. The chessboard sat mid-game, and the fireplace, long since cold, still held the last remnants of a burned note. Poirot moved to the desk and, with a deliberate motion, lifted the bishop from the chessboard. He turned it over in his fingers, examining it with the kind of care one might give to an invaluable relic. I sighed. "Poirot, you keep coming back to that piece, but I still don't see—" He held up a hand. "Hastings, what did I say before? Sir Reginald left us a message. This bishop was moved deliberately." I rubbed my forehead. "You think the bishop means something?" Poirot nodded. "Well, more importantly, It was meant to distract us. He set the bishop down and suddenly reached for the knight instead. His fingers brushed against the piece, then stopped. For a long moment, he was utterly still. Then, very gently, he lifted the knight and turned it over. Beneath it, hidden in the groove of the chessboard, was a small, folded slip of paper. My breath caught. "Good Lord, Poirot, what is that?" Poirot carefully unfolded it, his expression darkening as he read the message aloud. "You will pay for what you did." A silence stretched between us. Poirot exhaled, his voice quieter than before. "So it is as I feared." I shook my head in disbelief. "But that means Sir Reginald knew he was in danger?" Poirot's eyes met mine. "Not only that, mon ami, he knew exactly who was after him." A final interview. Poirot wasted no time. Within minutes he had gathered the entire household in the grand drawing-room, their faces a mixture of fear, suspicion, and impatience. Lady Margaret sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale. Charles Willoughby stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his usual arrogance replaced by something darker, something uncertain. Eleanor Marsh sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly, while Henry Fielding, the solicitor, watched Poirot with narrowed eyes. Even Sergeant Wilkes, the local constable, had arrived, his notepad in hand. Poirot stood in front of them, his small frame commanding the room with effortless authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we have reached the end. The puzzle is complete. The clues all accounted for. Now I shall reveal the truth of what happened to Sir Reginald Willoughby." A hush fell over the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Sir Reginald was murdered, yes, but his death was not impulsive. No, it was carefully planned. He was meant to die, and he knew it. He turned to Lady Margaret. "Madam, your husband feared for his life, did he not?" She nodded hesitantly. "Yes, but he wouldn't tell me why." Poirot's gaze flicked to Eleanor Marsh. "Mademoiselle, your father, Alfred Pembroke, was ruined by Sir Reginald. You had every reason to despise him." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I did, but I didn't kill him." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, you did not." A murmur spread through the room. Poirot let it settle before speaking again. "No, mes amis. The true culprit is someone who had even more to lose than an old grudge, someone who stood to lose everything if Sir Reginald lived." His eyes landed on Henry Fielding, the solicitor. "Monsieur Fielding, you murdered Sir Reginald Willoughby." A collective gasp rang out. Fielding's face drained of color. "That's a damned lie," he spat. Poirot's expression remained calm. "No, monsieur. It is the truth. Sir Reginald discovered you had been embezzling his money, perhaps for years. He was going to expose you, ruin you, and so you acted first." Lady Margaret inhaled sharply. "Henry, is that true?" Fielding's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is absurd. You have no proof." Poirot arched a brow. "Ah, but I do." He held up the note from the chessboard. "This, monsieur, was written by you." Fielding's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. Poirot caught it. "You knew Sir Reginald was onto you. You tried to scare him, to warn him off, but it did not work. So you planned his murder. You coated an object, perhaps the rim of his glass, or even a chess piece, with a fast-absorbing poison." The room was deathly silent. Poirot continued. "But that was not enough, was it? You needed to make sure no one suspected you. So you locked the door from the inside using a simple trick, a piece of string looped through the keyhole, pulling it shut once you had left." He turned to Sergeant Wilkes. "Search his belongings, Sergeant. I guarantee you will find the remains of that string." Wilkes nodded grimly. "Right away, sir." Fielding's jaw clenched. "This is nonsense. You can't prove—" Poirot raised a hand. "Ah, but we can. You see, monsieur, you made one final mistake." Poirot stepped closer. "You tried to kill Eleanor Marsh, but you got sloppy. You thought removing the poisoned tea would erase the evidence. But you forgot one thing." Fielding's breath hitched. Poirot smiled. The fingerprints on the cup. The color drained from Fielding's face. Sergeant Wilkes stepped forward. "I'll be taking you into custody, Mr. Fielding." There was no protest this time. Fielding simply sagged and defeated. Poirot straightened his cuffs. "And there you have it, mes amis. A killer unmasked." A breath of relief swept through the room. Poirot exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of the case. "Hastings," he murmured, "justice has been served." And with that, the storm over Hawthorne Manor finally began to clear. Chapter 7. Poirot assembles the puzzle. The air in Hawthorne Manor's grand drawing room had shifted. Moments ago, it had been a chamber of uncertainty and fear. Now, with Henry Fielding's guilt laid bare, a silence heavier than any spoken word settled upon the household. Fielding, once composed and professional, sat slumped in his chair, his usual air of quiet authority replaced with something raw, defeat. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Poirot had trapped him as surely as a hunter ensnaring its prey. Lady Margaret Willoughby, still visibly shaken, sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Charles Willoughby, the estranged nephew, stood stiffly by the fireplace, arms crossed, his usual arrogance tempered by something more guarded. Eleanor Marsh, pale but resolute, had regained some of her composure, though her eyes were shadowed with the weight of the truth. Sergeant Wilkes stood near Fielding, his notebook tucked under one arm, his other hand resting near the handcuffs at his belt. He, like the rest of us, was waiting for Poirot to complete the puzzle. And then Poirot spoke. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Tonight we bring justice to the dead. But before we can close this case entirely, let us recount exactly how the crime was committed." I leaned forward slightly. I had seen Poirot work through a case many times, but this was always the part I found most enthralling. Watching him lay everything out in perfect order, like an artist unveiling his masterpiece. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and began pacing slowly, his voice steady and assured. "It all began with a betrayal that took place years before Sir Reginald's murder." His gaze flickered toward Eleanor Marsh. "Sir Reginald Willoughby and Alfred Pembroke were once business partners. But greed, mes amis, is a powerful thing. Reginald deceived his partner, leaving Pembroke to ruin and disgrace while he grew richer. It was a sin he did not acknowledge for many years." Poirot turned toward Lady Margaret. "But guilt, madame, is a peculiar thing. When a man nears the end of his life, he often seeks redemption." Lady Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. "He was troubled these last months. He wouldn't speak of it much, but I knew he was afraid." Poirot's expression softened for a moment. "Yes?" "Because he had received, letters, threats, from someone who had learned of his past crime, someone who demanded retribution. And so he made a decision." He let his words settle before continuing. "Sir Reginald planned to change his will." A ripple of reaction spread through the room. Poirot nodded. "Oui. He intended to leave a portion of his estate to Eleanor Marsh, the daughter of the man he had wronged." Eleanor inhaled sharply. "So he really was trying to make amends?" Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, mademoiselle. But not everyone was pleased with this change." His gaze snapped back to Henry Fielding. "Were they, Monsieur Fielding?" Fielding did not answer. He sat rigid, staring at the floor. Poirot pressed on, his voice never wavering. "You had been embezzling from Sir Reginald's estate for years. Oh, At first it was small amounts, carefully hidden, but over time your theft grew bolder, and then you learned of his plans to change his will. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with certainty. And that, monsieur, was the moment you realized that if Sir Reginald lived, you would be ruined. I exhaled slowly. It all made sense now. Poirot continued, his hands making small, precise gestures as he spoke. You needed to silence him before he could sign the new will, so you devised a plan. Fielding let out a short, bitter laugh. You think you're so clever, Poirot. But you still haven't explained how I did it. Poirot smiled. Ah, but I was saving the best for last, monsieur. He turned to me. Hastings, recall the locked door, the seeming impossibility of the crime. How could a man be murdered in a room that was locked from the inside? I nodded. Yes, I still don't understand that part. Poirot lifted a finger. It was a trick, mon ami. He stepped toward the desk, where the glass of port remained untouched. The poison was not in the drink, Poirot announced. No, that was a misdirection, one you wished us to believe. The true poison was delivered in a different way. His voice dropped slightly, building suspense. Sir Reginald was poisoned through touch. A murmur swept the room. Poirot continued. The murderer, Fielding, coated a surface with a fast-absorbing poison. Not a drink, but something the victim would inevitably touch. He picked up the chess piece. The knight, he said softly. It was poison. A stunned silence fell. Poirot nodded. Sir Reginald was an avid chess player. He handled the pieces frequently, and the poison was absorbed through his skin. It would have taken time. But when the effect began, he might not have even realized what was happening. I exhaled sharply. And then the locked door? Poirot smiled slightly. A simple trick. A piece of thin twine looped through the keyhole, pulling the door shut after Fielding left. When we arrived, it appeared locked from the inside. Sergeant Wilkes let out a slow whistle. Clever. Poirot turned back to Fielding. Clever, yes, but not perfect. You made one mistake. Fielding's jaw clenched. And what was that? Poirot lifted the note from the chessboard, the one Sir Reginald had hidden beneath the knight. Sir Reginald realized, too late, what was happening. He left a clue. He tapped the bishop. Not the piece itself, but its position on the board. It was meant to tell us where to look. Fielding said nothing. But I saw the defeat in his eyes. Sergeant Wilkes stepped forward. I think we've heard enough. Mr. Fielding, you'll be coming with me. A long silence. Then Fielding slumped forward, covering his face with his hands. Poirot straightened his cuffs. And there it is, mes amis. The case is closed. I let out a breath. Mon Dieu, Poirot, you really are remarkable. Poirot smiled faintly. It is not I who am remarkable, Hastings. It is simply that the truth always reveals itself if one knows where to look. And with that, the long shadow over Hawthorne Manor finally lifted. Chapter 8. Justice and Reflection. The tension in Hawthorne Manor had finally lifted, but in its place was a hushed sense of finality, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Henry Fielding, the once respected solicitor, had been led away by Sergeant Wilkes, his face pale and drawn, his once controlled demeanor utterly shattered. Lady Margaret sat motionless in her chair, staring at the empty space where Fielding had sat just moments before. Charles Willoughby had retreated to the fireplace, staring into the embers, his usual arrogance replaced by something resembling shame. And Eleanor Marsh, for the first time since we had arrived, looked at peace, though her hand still trembled slightly in her lap. Poirot, as always, was composed and meticulous, straightening the cuffs of his immaculate suit before turning to face the remaining members of the household. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice calm yet commanding. Justice has been served. The murderer has been unmasked, and Sir Reginald has had his revenge from beyond the grave. A murmur of unease spread through the room. Poirot continued. This crime was not one of passion, nor impulse. It was a crime of cold calculation and desperation. Monsieur Fielding saw his world collapsing, and in an effort to save himself, he took a life. But as I always say, the truth, it cannot be hidden forever. Lady Margaret lifted her head suddenly. I trusted him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For years I trusted him. Poirot's gaze softened slightly. That, madam, is the cruelest trick of all. Betrayal often comes from those we least suspect. She exhaled shakily and turned toward Eleanor. And you, my dear. I suppose I owe you an apology. Eleanor gave a small, sad smile. I never wanted an apology, Lady Margaret. I only want to know the truth. Poirot nodded approvingly. And now, mademoiselle, you have it. Charles, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke, his voice low and bitter. And what of me, Poirot? He turned, his sharp features lit by the dim glow of the fire. I suppose you believe I should feel lucky. After all, my uncle is dead, and I still inherit everything. Poirot's sharp eyes landed on him. That, monsieur, is a question only you can answer. Are you lucky? Or do you, perhaps, feel guilt? Charles flinched slightly, but said nothing. Poirot took a step closer. Tell me, Monsieur Willoughby, had Sir Reginald lived, and had he truly disinherited you, what would you have done? Charles's jaw clenched. You think I would have killed him? Poirot lifted his hands in a small shrug. The thought may have crossed your mind. But let us not dwell on what did not happen. Instead, ask yourself, why did your uncle distrust you so? Charles's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Because I was a disappointment to him. Poirot regarded him for a long moment before giving a slight nod. Perhaps, monsieur. Or perhaps he simply wished for you to be something more. Charles turned away, staring into the fire, his thoughts his own. A final conversation. Later that evening, Poirot and I found ourselves back at the Rose and Crown Inn, seated comfortably in a quiet corner near the hearth. The innkeeper, sensing that we had been through a great ordeal, had provided us with tea and warm scones, which Poirot politely ignored in favor of his tisane. I exhaled slowly, letting the events of the past few days settle in my mind. Well, Poirot, I said at last. I must admit I didn't see it coming. Fielding seemed so insignificant. Poirot chuckled lightly. Ah, Hastings, you still judge by appearance rather than motive. A murderer need not be loud or flamboyant. Sometimes he is the quiet man in the corner, patient, watching, waiting. I nodded, stirring my tea. And the poison. That was clever. I still don't understand how you figured it out. Poirot smiled slightly. Because, mon ami, the locked room mystery was not the puzzle at all. The puzzle was why Sir Reginald would leave behind such a cryptic message. The chess piece, the unfinished game. He knew he was dying, and he wanted us to find the truth. I sighed. And Eleanor, do you think she will be all right? Poirot's expression softened. She has carried the burden of her father's downfall for many years. Now she is free of it, and she has received something she never expected, a form of justice. I smiled slightly. And you, Poirot? Do you ever get tired of solving the